The Shadow in the Attic by H.P. Lovecraft. Chapter 1. My great-uncle Uriah Garrison was not a man to cross. A dark-faced, shaggy-browed man with wild black hair and a face that haunted my childhood dreams. I knew him only in those early years. My father crossed him, and he died, strangely, smothered in his bed 100 miles from Arkham, where my great-uncle lived. My Aunt Sophia condemned him, and she died, tripped on a stair by nothing visible. How many others might there have been? Who knows? Who could do more than whisper fearfully of what dark powers were at Uriah Garrison's command? And of how much of what was said of him was superstitious gossip, baseless and malicious, none could say. We never saw him again after my father's death, my mother hating her Uncle Ben, and until the day she died, though she never forgot him. Nor did I, either him or his gambrel-roofed house on Aylesbury Street, in that part of Arkham south of the Miskatonic River, not far from Hangman's Hill and its wooded graveyard. Indeed, Hangman's Brook flowed through his grounds, wooded, too, like the cemetery on the hill. I never forgot the shadowed house where he lived alone and had someone in, by night, to keep his house for him. The high-ceilinged rooms, the shunned attic which no one entered by day, and into which no one was permitted ever to go with a lamp or light of any kind. The small-paned windows that looked out upon the bushes and trees, the fan-lit doors. It was the kind of house that could not fail to lay its dark magic upon an impressionable young mind, and it did upon mine, filling me with brooding fancies and, sometimes, terrifying dreams, from which I started awake and fled to my mother's side, and one memorable night lost my way and came upon my great-uncle's housekeeper with her strange, emotionless, expressionless face. She stared at me and I at her, as across unfathomable gulfs of space, before I turned and sped away, spurred by new fear imposed upon those engendered in dreams. I did not miss going there. There was no love lost between us, and there was little communication, though there were occasions on which I was moved to send Uriah Garrison a short greeting, the old man's birthday, or Christmas, to which he never responded, which was as well. It was, therefore, all the more surprising to me that I should have inherited his property, and a small competence at his death, with no more annoying a provision but that I inhabit the house for the summer months of the first year after his death. He had known, clearly, that my teaching obligations would not permit occupancy throughout the year. It was not much to ask. I had no intention of keeping the property. Arkham had even in those years begun to grow outward along the Aylesbury Pike, and the city which had once been so detached from my great-uncle's home was now pressing close upon it, and the property would be a desirable acquisition for someone. Arkham held no particular attraction for me, though I was fascinated by the legends that haunted it, by its clustering gambrel roofs and the architectural ornamentation of 2 centuries ago. This fascination did not run deep, as Arkham as a permanent home did not appeal to me. But before I could sell Uriah Garrison's house, it was necessary to occupy it, in accordance with the terms of his will. In June of 1928, over my mother's protests, and in spite of her dark hints that Uriah Garrison had been peculiarly cursed and abhorred, I took up my residence in the house on Aylesbury Street. It required little effort to do so, for the house had been left furnished since my great-uncle's death in March of that year, and someone, clearly, had kept it clean, as I saw on my arrival from Brattleboro. My great-uncle's housekeeper had evidently been instructed to continue her duties, at least until my occupancy. But my great-uncle's lawyer, an ancient fellow who still affected high collars and solemn black attire, knew nothing of any arrangements Uriah Garrison had made, when I called upon him to investigate the provisions of the will. "I've never been in the house, Mr. Duncan," he said. "If he made arrangements to have it kept clean, there must have been another key. I sent you the one I had, as you know. There is no other, to my knowledge. As for the provisions of my great-uncle's will, These were barrenly simple. I was merely to occupy the house through the months of June, July, and August, or for 90 days following my coming, if my teaching obligations made it impossible to take up occupancy on the 1st of June. There were no other conditions whatsoever, not even the ban on the attic room I had expected to see set down. "You may find the neighbors a trifle unfriendly at first," Mr. Saltonstall went on. "Your great-uncle was a man of odd habits, and he rebuffed the neighbors. I suppose he resented their moving into the neighborhood, and they, for their part, took umbrage at his independence, and made much of the fact that, because he took walks into the cemetery on Hangman's Hill, he seemed to prefer the company of the dead to that of the living." As to what the old man had been like in his last years, about which I asked, "He was a lusty, vigorous old fellow, very tough, actually," answered Mr. Saltonstall. "But, as so often happens, when his decline came, it came fast. He was dead in just 1 week. Senility, the doctor said." "His mind?" I asked. Mr. Saltonstall smiled frostily. "Well now, Mr. Duncan, you must know that there was always some question about your uncle's mind. He had some very strange ideas which were, in a real sense, archaic. This witchcraft exploration, for one thing. He spent a good deal of money investigating the Salem trials. But you'll find his library intact, and filled with books on the subject. Other than his obsessive interest in one subject, he was a coldly rational man. That describes him best, unfriendly, and holding himself aloof." So Great-uncle Uriah Garrison had not changed in the years that had intervened between my childhood and my late 20s. And the house had not changed either. It still had that air of watchful waiting, like someone huddled together against the weather, waiting for a stagecoach. Nothing more recent, certainly, for the house was 200 years old, and, though well kept up, it had never been invaded by electricity, and its plumbing was archaic. Apart from its appointments, and some aspects of its finishing lumber, the house had no value. Only the property on which it stood had considerable monetary worth, in view of the expansion of Arkham along the Aylesbury Pike. The furniture was in cherry and mahogany and black walnut, and I more than half suspected that if Rhoda, my fiancée, saw it, she would want to keep it for our own house when we built one. And, what with the money the sale of the property and the furniture might realize, we should be able to build that house, leaving my salary as an English department assistant and hers as an instructor in philology and archaeology to keep it up. 3 months' time was not long to do without electricity, and I could endure the ancient plumbing for those weeks. But I decided forthwith that I could not do without a telephone. So I drove into Arkham and ordered a telephone installed without delay. While I was in the business section, I stopped in at the telegraph office on Church Street and sent wires to both my mother and Rhoda, assuring them of my arrival and inviting Rhoda, at her leisure, to drive around and inspect my newly acquired property. I stopped long enough, too, for a good meal at one of the restaurants, bought a few necessary provisions for breakfast, however little inclined I might be toward building a fire in the old iron range in the kitchen, and went back fortified against hunger for the remainder of that day. I had brought with me various books and papers necessary to the doctoral dissertation on which I was at work, and I knew that the shelves of the library of Miskatonic University, scarcely a mile from the house, would offer me all the additional assistance I might need. Thomas Hardy and the Wessex country hardly constituted a subject so obscure as to make necessary application to the Widener, or some more expanded college library. So to that work I set myself, until mid-evening of my first day in Uriah Garrison's old house, when, being tired, I went to bed in what had been my great-uncle's room on the second floor, rather than in the guest room on the ground floor.